All right, so yeah, we're going to do things a little bit differently this time around. I went ahead and looked at the reading guide and kind of the progress that's going on there right now, and I really wanted this to kind of serve not only as a supplement to the usual lecture that we have in class, but to that reading guide, and maybe it'll help kind of fill out the rest of the reading guide before Friday, so y'all can use that to study for the prep quizzes. So this module focuses on two main systems, circulatory systems and digestive systems in both animals as well as plants. And for plants, plant nutrition and how plants acquire nutrients often involves relationships with other species. We think of plants as these things that can generate their own energy, and yes, that's true, but they still need things like nitrogen to make protein and water, and they need to get that from their environment, not just sunlight. And to do that, plants rely on other organisms for the most part. In terms of plant growth, nitrogen is one of the most limiting nutrients that limits plant growth. And so it's a very important resource for that reason. But plants are faced with this dilemma where they can only absorb nitrogen as certain compounds, nitrates and ammonium. And so to get those nutrients, we look towards what's called the nitrogen cycle, which just describes transformation from atmospheric nitrogen, which occurs as N2, into those compounds that plants can kind of absorb and utilize. And to do these transformations into those usable compounds, plants rely on nitrogen fixing bacteria. Specifically, they rely on two main types, which are ammonifying bacteria. So when you're thinking ammonifying bacteria, they make the ammonium, and then nitrifying bacteria, which make the nitrates. So pretty easy to make that word association, I think. And then you'll often hear about a third type of bacteria, which is the denitrifying bacteria. And this is just mentioned to kind of complete this nitrogen cycle. This is the bacteria that converts environmental nitrogen in the soil to atmospheric nitrogen, therefore sort of completing this loop. And so one thing you'll notice is that, although the plants can directly get the ammonium from the nitrogen, the ammonifying bacteria, the nitrifying bacteria are further converting that ammonium at the same time. So some of the ammonium goes to plants, but some of it goes to this nitrifying bacteria, which then converts it to nitrates, a different nitrogen containing compound that plants need. So they rely on bacteria to get their nitrogen. They also rely on fungi for obtaining other types of minerals. But I'm not going to focus too much on that one because we've talked about this relationship between plants and fungi. You might remember the term mycorrhizae. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in class, but for the sake of time, I don't want to kind of go back down that route and kind of waste your time reteaching you the same material. Instead, I'll kind of talk a little bit about some adaptations plants have to get some of these nutrients like nitrogen in their own way, away from relying on bacteria. And it's resulted in some really weird, unusual kind of nutritional adaptations that some plants have adopted. And these adaptations kind of characterize the plants into three main groups. And those are the epiphytes, the parasitic plants, and the carnivorous plants. Now, the epiphytes grow on other plants and obtain, kind of suck out water and minerals from rain and from the plant that way. Instead of tapping their hosts for sustenance, they kind of just latch onto the plant, but get the water and minerals from the rain itself. In parasitic plants, they're doing the same thing. They're latching onto, a tree or some other plant, but they're kind of sucking the nutrients dry from the plant itself. They're absorbing water, sugars, and minerals directly from the living host plant. So this is a kind of distinction you want to know between epiphytes and parasitic plants. Epiphytes aren't getting their nutrients from the plant itself, they're just attached to them. Parasitic plants, on the other hand, do suck the nutrients dry from the plant. And one example of parasitic plants are mistletoe. We're at this point nearing Halloween, and after that we got Thanksgiving and then Christmas to think about. And that's the mistletoe that we hang to get smooches or whatever, is actually a parasitic plant that we're hanging in our houses. And then the last type, which is the one maybe everyone's most familiar with, are the carnivorous plants. So these are plants that have adaptations for trapping insects and other kind of small animals for their main nitrogen source. Carnivine in Pokemon is modeled after one of the most famous carnivorous plants, the Venus flytraps. I didn't put the picture up here, but now that I see the picture plant, I remember for you Gen 1 fans out there, Victory Bell, Bellsprout, and Weeping Bell are all modeled off after the carnivorous plant, the pitcher plant. Now we contrast this and move away from plants and into animals, and animals have a completely different way of obtaining their resources. And for animals, nutrition, the way we gain our nutrients, can be broken down into 4 main steps, and that's ingestion, digestion, absorption, and ultimately elimination. And so this kind of follows the track from your mouth to the bathroom, where ingestion is the act of eating or feeding. And in the case of this python, wrapping its prey and then kind of disjointing its jaw to eat it up. What some people kind of get confused on, though, is kind of this line between ingestion and digestion. So when we say ingestion is the act of eating or feeding, it's actually a very short process of the nutrition kind of sequential steps. It's just kind of getting the food in our mouth. Once you start chewing that food up, you've begun the process of digestion. And it's not something that we commonly think of as digestion, but it's a specific step in digestion called mechanical digestion. And so this includes those steps of chewing, because as you're chewing, you're also starting the chemical digestion process. So mechanical digestion involves breaking your food substance into smaller and smaller pieces. And you can imagine how that happens, but you need this process to increase the overall surface area of food that you have. The smaller and smaller you make food, the more surface area that there is, and that's where chemical digestion comes into play. So chemical digestion will kind of split the food into the small molecules that can then travel down the rest of your alimentary canal and digestive tract. 2 terms we'll kind of see here in a minute. And so the digestion starts right when you're chewing, actually. And then the saliva we emit contains enzymes that are also chemically digesting that food. After that, we get into the steps of absorption. So after the food has been broken down small enough, then those nutrients still have to get into our cells, right? And this is that process of absorption, where the cells within the body are secreting enzymes to collect the usable nutrients and transport it into the cell. And then ultimately what isn't absorbed ends up getting eliminated in the passage of undigested material out of the digestive system, and then it's over. And in terms of digestion, we can break it down a few different ways, but one common way of breaking things down is in terms of intra versus extracellular digestion. And you kind of want to break this term down into its components to really understand what we're getting at here. Instead of just memorizing the terms, just break this down. Intra means within. And so intracellular digestion is getting at the fact that digestion occurs inside of a cell. And so, it's hard to imagine this because it doesn't really apply to us necessarily. But intracellular digestion is what very simple, often unicellular, but some multicellular organisms, what they do. They engulf cells by phagocytosis. They will envelop the small food item, and then that food item gets broken down inside the cell. Now, what we're more familiar with perhaps is extracellular digestion, which is the breakdown of food particles outside of cells. Now, within this category of extracellular digestion, we can break it down even further in terms of whether or not the animal has a simple or a complex body plan. And so animals with simple body plans are things like sponges, as well as hydras, so things in the Cnidaria group. And these animals with simple body plans have what's called a gastrovascular cavity. It's basically just everything for it. It's both the gastric, digestive tract, as well as the vascular system that the animal has. And it functions in both digestion as well as the distribution of nutrients. Now, more complex animals have a more complex digestive system. They have what's called a complete digestive tract, also known as an alimentary canal. So, in simple body plan animals, they have incomplete digestion. And in more complex animals, we see the complete digestive tract, the alimentary canal. And the main thing about this is it's complete because it has both a mouth on one end and an anus on the other. Whereas with the simple body plan organisms, it's all essentially the same whole, the mouth and the anus. And once you start looking within the alimentary canals, they're from system to system. Alimentary canals can have specialized regions that carry out digestion and absorption in this sort of stepwise fashion, where as you go from the mouth to the anus, things get broken down more and more, and nutrients can get more and more absorbed in places like the intestine. Some of these we saw in lab last week, if you're in the lab course, how, with the earthworm, it's a nice, simple enough body plan. It's not a simple body plan in terms of this hydra, but it's the simplest animal system that has a complete digestive tract. And you can see it pretty clearly how things get broken down. Things enter the mouth, the pharynx will grind things up. It passes through the esophagus and into the crop and gizzard, where things get broken down more. And then you're entering the intestine, where everything has been broken down as much as it's going to be. And in the intestine, the job is to absorb those nutrients. Now, in all mammals, including us, the digestive system consists of both the alimentary canal that I just went over, as well as what are called accessory glands. And these secrete different digestive juices and enzymes through different ducts. So in mammals, the accessory glands are things like the salivary glands, what produces our saliva, as well as the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. Important stuff to know, potentially for prep quizzes in the future. And kind of just breaking this down one more time, just so we can kind of see this in terms of humans. The first stage of digestion, remember, is that mechanical one, taking place in the mouth or the oral cavity. And one of the first steps, other than us chewing, is the salivary glands delivering saliva to that oral cavity through the ducts of the salivary glands. The teeth chew the food into smaller particles that are exposed to amylase, which is one of those enzymes released within the saliva. And this helps to break down different polymers, like glucose polymers. Saliva also contains mucus. We don't actually think of that, but it's this mixture of water and salts and cells that are going to further help break things down. From there, the tongue kind of helps shape the food into what's called a bolus, literally just means a ball. And that's, we don't think about it, but that shape is actually necessary for us to help help that food travel throughout the rest of our alimentary canal. From there, we enter the throat or the pharynx, which kind of opens to the esophagus, which connects to the stomach. So each time you swallow, an important thing to note is that a flap of cartilage kind of covers your vocal cords and the opening kind of between them. And this is what kind of prevents us from choking. So when you don't chew enough and think about what you're eating, your body can't respond in time. It actually enters your windpipe, the trachea, and you end up choking, right? Always why it's important to chew your food. Now, in terms of the esophagus, this helps food travel from the pharynx down to the stomach. And it does so in this sort of like rhythmic, unconscious cycle of contraction. It's not something that we actually can even feel, but it's happening essentially all the time. And your chewing actually helps the esophagus kind of get ready for those rhythmic contractions until everything has been pushed into the stomach. So that's the digestive system. Now for the rest of time, I kind of want to focus on circulatory systems, the other part of this module, essentially. Now, the circulatory system is, how water as well as different nutrients travel throughout our body. The digestive system focuses on how we get those nutrients to our body. But once those cells are absorbed, they have to go to places like our arms, our legs, other parts that are far away often from the digestive system. And the way this happens is through the circulatory system. And plants and animals, as you might imagine, have very different circulatory systems. With plants, it's all driven by transpiration, actually. So the way plants move water and nutrients in the form of xylem sap long distances throughout the plant is through transpiration. And specifically, it relies a lot on this idea of the cohesion tension hypothesis. According to the cohesion tension hypothesis, transpiration kind of provides the pool for the ascent of water as well as xylem sap throughout the plant. So you can read about this in more detail in your book, but basically through transpiration in the leaves, which are happening near the top of the plant, water is evaporating. And it kind of creates this chain reaction where all the water that leaves has to eventually be replaced. So water gets evaporated and it creates a sort of indentation between cells, which needs to eventually be filled, right? And so water, because of its cohesive properties, which I'll talk about in a second, it replaces that water that has evaporated. And this starts that chain reaction throughout the whole plant until you get to the source of that water. Water comes from the roots of the plants, from the bottom, and in the end, the empty pockets of waterless space in the roots gets filled up by environmental water outside of the plant. And so, I talked about cohesion. So how does cohesion and adhesion help in pulling water up the plant body? This goes back to some basic chemistry that you might have heard about, as far back as high school or in an intro chemistry course here. But water molecules, remember, are attracted to each other through this cohesion process. And then the adhesion refers to how water adheres to the cell walls of the plant. So think of it, don't necessarily put too much thought into it because, you can apply some logic to this. When we talk about things adhering, you think of stickers, right? It's a sticker sticking to something else, right? it's adhering, and that's what adhesion refers to, is water binding to something else, in this case, the cell wall. Cohesion, think of cooperation. You cooperate by, working with others like you, other humans, other members of your same species. And the same thing with cohesion is sticking to members of your own, water sticking to water. And so through this combination of cohesion and adhesion, water can kind of bind to itself. So the water molecules all stick to each other. And through adhesion, sticking through the cell walls, it can climb up the xylem. Therefore, kind of explaining how water that arrives from the bottom of the plant, the roots, climbs up. So if water evaporates in the leaves, the water that evaporated is replaced by water right below it. And you continue this all the way down until you get to the roots. The water in the xylem is still climbing up because it's just following the missing water right above it. And ultimately you get to the roots, and if the roots become empty, then the water from right around it will enter the roots. It creates a void in the roots, this pool, which gets filled by the outside environment. And this continues throughout the life cycle of the plant. So in animals, small molecules like oxygen and CO2 move between cells and their immediate surroundings through a process called diffusion. Now, in terms of diffusion, the time that it takes these small molecules to move from cell to cell is, proportional to the distance that's traveled. And because of this, diffusion is actually only efficient over really small distances. So diffusion actually becomes a big limitation for larger animals because surface area is important. So, in single-celled organisms, hold on, let me pause this recording. Sorry about that. I had to pause the recording. Somebody was knocking on the door. So what I was getting at is that diffusion is really only a process that makes sense for really small or single-celled organisms in terms of transporting water, oxygen and CO2 throughout the entire organism. Now, some animals have those simple body plans that we saw in the case of the hydra and sponges to account for this. So basically, they make their gastrovascular cavity really big so that there's really pretty much all the cells that the sponge or the hydra has are pretty much exposed directly to the outside environment where they can get oxygen and CO2. But for things with more complex body plans, like this axolotl or ourselves, we need kind of something else. And so more complex organisms like ourselves have adopted alternative adaptations for this efficient exchange of oxygen and CO2, and that is a circulatory system. And that's what allows the oxygen acquired from these gills, like in this axolotl or in this whooper, it allows oxygen to be transported throughout the rest of the body. Now, in terms of circulatory systems, they can be either open or closed. So in arthropods and in some mollusks, circulatory fluid kind of just bathes the organs directly in what's called an open circulatory system. In the closed circulatory system, though, blood, the circulatory fluid, is confined to these vessels, what we might be more familiar with since we have closed circulatory systems. And it's distinct from kind of interstitial fluid, kind of the fluid outside of these vessels. Whereas in an open circulatory system, it's all kind of mushed together in hemolymph. These closed circulatory systems, we associate them with ourselves, but they're in very basic animals as well, like earthworms, members of Annelida, other types of mollusks, and all vertebrates. So in this system, the way blood moves is through the use of one or more hearts pumping blood through the vessels. Another way to further break down circulation is in terms of single versus double circulation. So this is maybe a concept that's a little harder to grasp than the open versus closed idea, but I'll try to break it down for you. So certain animals like sharks, rays, and bony fishes have single circulation, where there's this two-chambered heart. And in single circulation, blood kind of leaves the heart and passes through two sets of capillary beds before returning back to the heart. So if you follow this along, it goes through one capillary bed, another capillary bed, and then it's back at the heart. And through this process, blood will acquire in the gills, the gill capillary bed, and then slowly lose in the body capillary bed, the oxygen. And then it goes back to the heart and then is pumped right back to those gills where it acquires oxygen, loses it throughout the body, back to the heart. And so as the animal actually swims, the contractions and relaxation of the muscles in swimming help to kind of accelerate the pace of this circulation. So if you see a fish start to swim fast, one side effect is that it actually gets more oxygen, which it might need if it's trying to escape from a predator. Now, in other organisms like amphibians, reptiles, mammals, they all have double circulation. Now, in this case, you really want to look at the figures to kind of differentiate the two. Now, having kind of both pumps within a heart will simplify coordination of this pumping cycle. So as you can see, in the heart of a double circulation system, you get both oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood entering the system. And so, this is showing a frog, but it's the same in other animals. Ultimately, oxygen poor blood will enter the lung or skin capillaries. So this skin capillary portion is only relevant for things like amphibians, which have what are called a pulmocutaneous circuit. Might not be familiar with that term because we have what's called a pulmonary circuit. So the pulmonary, pulmon meaning lung, this is where our capillary bed is located, and this is where we get oxygen. Oxygen poor blood becomes oxygen rich. In amphibians, it's called a pulmocutaneous because pulmon coming from lung and cutaneous coming from the skin. They can actually get oxygen from both their skin and their lungs. So that's where that term comes from. But oxygen fills the blood. You got oxygen-rich blood now, which then goes back to the heart and then transported throughout the rest of the body that needs that oxygen. And so that oxygen-rich blood becomes oxygen-poor blood and then goes back to the heart. And so the heart kind of has two steps in the double circulation step. It pumps oxygen-poor blood to the lungs, and it pumps oxygen-rich blood throughout the body where it's needed. So I'll leave this here because in class we'll kind of go into much deeper dives into the specifics of things like blood flow and other processes relating to both the circulatory and the digestive systems in both plants and animals. So hopefully this helps out with completing the reading guide and prepping for the prep quiz. And I will